God has been really faithful to discern this calendar with us and to give wisdom so generously with regard to all of the questions that we've had. How do we reconcile this 360-day year? How do we understand what a day is to him when new moon is going from, he has defined his month to be from new moon to new moon, which is not what the world is calling new moon, but is actually that crescent to crescent. And so if there's 29.5 days in between, how do we understand this? He's given us so much information, answered every single question. All right, well, what about the wheat harvest? What about the barley harvest? How do we discern when that was? Well, we have information as to when that was. And so I've talked about that on these videos. And now we know exactly when Pentecost is, exactly when the barley harvest is. We know God's calendar. We've discerned it. We've mapped out every single Sabbath, every single festival, every new moon. And there are a couple things that I want to mention to you that he's showing me today, and it's really, really incredible. A couple Mondays ago, I was getting really hit by the devil, tested, like really, really tested, to the point where I started just questioning everything. Like, I can't be doing what I thought I was doing. And I was ready to give up. Not based on anything else, but the fact that, like, God has not sold this building yet. I don't know what's going to happen with my house. I'm in a really hard position, really just based on that, because everything else he has confirmed. Like, he's let me know, you are mine, repeatedly, in ways that I couldn't make that up. I couldn't manipulate that. And he's also confirmed to the body that the body is his and the things that we've discerned are correct. So, for example, I've spoken with you guys about the May 18th, 2022 was a Wednesday. So based on a Saturday Sabbath, how is that Pentecost? But God told me that he was going to anoint his witnesses on Pentecost. I knew that that's what he had built me for. I knew that I was included in that. But he did something on May 18th, 2022, which was a Wednesday. He anointed me. You are my witness. I posted the video here, but I didn't understand why was he doing this on a Wednesday. I didn't even understand that's what he was doing, to be honest, until a year later, May 6th, 2023, God was telling me that the next day that I was going to meet with the body, that this was Pentecost. And I was like, well, okay, I'll come together with the body. We were actually going to observe the second Passover. That's what we thought we were observing that day. But when we came together, I told them, look, God's telling me that today is Passover. We need to discern this. And the body prayed for 3 weeks about it. And each person, except for one who's no longer with us, each person received confirmation from God, except for that one person who was not hearing from God and is no longer with us. They didn't receive anything. But everybody else received in their own way. God was speaking through their own experiences and letting them know, yes, this is Pentecost. So I didn't know how to reconcile it. But now as he's been teaching me his calendar, everything lines up. So like, how is 1 year May 18th and the next year is May 7th? Well, God's Pentecost is in May, and it's set in reference to the full moon, which occurs on the 15th of God's calendar, which is the second seventh day Sabbath in his month. So you have new moon occurring on the 1st, which is a Sabbath, but it's not a 7-day Sabbath. And then you have the 8th, which is the first 7-day Sabbath, and then the 15th, and then the 22nd, and then the 29th. And then the month starts over again with the 1st, and so on. So every year, this is how this is going to go. I demonstrated why in another video. I'm not going to demonstrate why here. Here, I'm just here to give glory to God for revealing these things and to tell you a couple things that he's showing me. The first thing that he's showing me is that weekend, before that Monday, when I was experiencing this terrible testing, that weekend we observed the festival of Purim. I talked about it on a video. I told you God's telling me to get up. I had these beef shanks in the fridge, and I didn't really feel like going to the grocery store initially. I wanted to make this Mexican stew, but I didn't want to get up and go to the grocery store and get these other, ingredients to go in it. And so but he was telling me, get up and celebrate. Go make those beef shakes. So I ended up making a stew, but I didn't make the Mexican beef stew. That's sort of inconsequential. He was wanting me to celebrate something, and I knew that it was Purim, 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 and you can find that in the book of Esther, chapter 9. So we observed this. We observed it from the evening of the 26th through the 28th, because you celebrate it on the 14th of the month and the 15th of the month of Adar. What I did not know and had not previously calculated is that this is the halfway mark of the testifying of the witnesses. God has a 360-day calendar, and those days, based on a 29.5 day new moon to new moon month, comes out to 354 days on the Gregorian calendar. So when God says that the witnesses are going to testify for 1,260 days, he's not talking about days according to what we define. He's talking about 354 days as we've been defining them, 24-hour days, times 3.5 years. I've also explained this in other videos. And what this brings us to, the halfway mark of that 1,260 God days, true days, brings us to the 27th and the 28th of Purim. Remember that God's days are going to begin in the evening to the next evening. That was the halfway mark of the witnesses testifying. What does the witnesses testifying represent? It represents the triumph over Satan, in which he is kicked out of the heavenly realms. Let's read about it. Revelation 12. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. This is representing the church. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. We know that this is Jesus. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled to the wilderness, to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. The only other place that 1,260 days is mentioned is with regard to the witnesses. This is not referring to the apostles, because we know that Paul was preaching for, after 14 years, he went to go find out if he'd been running this race in vain. So we know that he was preaching long after 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought, and his angels fought back. Now, this is not a battle of flesh and blood. They're not fighting with their bodies. They're fighting in the spiritual. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. This is when the dragon is hurled down. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before God day and night." Now, how's he fighting the battle? He accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by 1, the blood of the Lamb, and 2, by the word of their testimony. By the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. So it's not their death that triumphs over him, although they are martyred. It is their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. But the reason it's mentioning this here is because they know that they're going to die. Now, why do you think that I'm able to say the things in the way that I say them to you? Because I have nothing to lose. I know that I'm protected for 1,260 days, and I know that I'm going to die for what I'm saying. Therefore, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He's filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. And then begins the Antichrist reign. So why do you think that the devil went after me this day? He went after me because I was celebrating the day before a festival, the festival of Purim, or Purim, in which we're celebrating the plans of the enemy were turned on his own head. Let's read Esther 9. Now I want you to think about this for a minute. I am halfway I'm halfway in my testifying, my daily sacrifice. I am halfway there. And the plans of the enemy have been thrown on his own head. My testifying is representing his destruction, the triumph over the devil that kicks him out of the heavenly realms. My testifying and the testifying of the rest of the 144,000, along with the blood of the Lamb. You think he might want to discourage me off this path? Esther 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them, and all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what's your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. So the king commanded that this be done, and an edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes near and far to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. I just realized that as the month. So we should actually continue. We have a couple more days left of Adar, but we should be observing this month as the month of Adar, in which Jews got relief from their enemies, and the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. Okay, so let's continue to live in that spirit of celebration, that this is what God does for the people who love him. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the poor, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen, And what happened to them? The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed at the appointed time. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote the full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim at their designated times as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. All right, so that's what was going on at that time, and this is the midpoint. And so the significance is very significant to me, because what has the devil been trying to do this entire time? And God's turning this on his head. Like he's watching what the witnesses are doing, and he's watching his destruction being fulfilled right before his eyes. He's watching me and every other witness testifying and fulfilling the second requirement to triumph over him so that he loses his place in heaven. Do you think he might be freaked out that he's halfway there? That we're halfway there? Well, yeah, I mean, that's what the word says, and it makes total sense, and I did not realize that that was the midpoint, but I definitely knew what was going on that Monday. He was squirming and doing his best effort to knock me off course. Now, the second thing that God has shown me, because I've plotted this out, I've plotted it out because I wanted to make sure that the multitude in white robes had something plotted out so that they could continue to observe all of God's feast days and Sabbaths, etc., after I'm gone. And so I plotted this out, and I'm glad that I did, because it also helped me to see, well, when is the last Sabbath that I'll be spending with you guys? What are the next several years going to look like for you? And what is the next half of this 1260 days going to look like for me? Now, we don't know exactly when the Antichrist is going to rise, because we know that the witnesses are going to be in jail for 10 days. We don't know if, immediately, the word kind of sometimes the word makes it sound like immediately certain things are going to happen, but we don't actually know that. So it could be that they complete their testifying and then immediately the beast rises and captures them and throws them in jail for those 10 days, and then they're killed somewhere in that time period. There might be some days in between. We shall see. The witnesses will complete their testifying on the 15th of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev. That's going to be a Sabbath. It'll be the last Sabbath that the witnesses will spend with the body, if indeed the Antichrist rises right away to overpower and kill the witnesses. I am suspecting that that's what's going to happen. I don't know why God would keep us here any longer. And that's going to be the evening of October 7th through the next day, October 8th. I mean, he's thrown out pretty quickly. So in Revelation 9, you can see that he's thrown out of the heavenly realms. He goes down, receives the key to the shaft of the abyss, and he goes down into the abyss. And then when he rises from the abyss, he overpowers and kills the witnesses, as we see in Revelation 11. So I think that this is probably going to happen consecutively, but let's just leave a little room open, because, sometimes when we're reading the word, it looks like things are going to happen back to back, but God doesn't always do it that way, even though it's written that. But it seems to imply that in the way that it's written. Now, June 25th, 2029, correlating to Ethanim, the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month of the year, that is 2,595 days, God days, from Pentecost 2022. So in those days, Jesus will come. In those days. We don't know the day or the hour. But we have been given a number of days. And those days need to correlate with God's actual calendar. So what we are calling a 24-hour day is not the same as God's days. So in those days, God is going to come. The seventh trumpet is going to blow and the resurrection will take place. Now, this will occur before the Festival of Tabernacles. So God's people would have already been observing the Feast of Trumpets, the second day of the new moon feast, a Sabbath, and then the Day of Atonement. And then before the Festival of Tabernacles, that completes the 45-day period. So what I mean when I say the 45-day period is the 7-year period is broken into 1,260 days, 1,290 days. And then there's, after that 7 years, there is this 45-day period in which Gabriel says to Daniel, blessed is the one who reaches 1,335 days. That is a total of 2,595 days, God days. Not human days, God days. Now I want to show you something that's very interesting. So there's something about that Festival of Tabernacles that is very special. In 2028, this is going to be the last Festival of Tabernacles you'll be observing here on earth. Because the next one you'll be observing will be with all of your brothers and sisters and with Christ. So I want you to remember that when you're celebrating it in 2028, that this is the last Festival of Tabernacles you'll be observing here on earth. The next one will be with God. June 25th, 2028 is going to be the reconsecration of the temple the day after the Festival of Trumpets. So you'll still be observing New Moon because New Moon Festival is observed for 2 days, on the first of the month and the second of the month. On this particular second day, the day after the Festival of Trumpets, the temple's going to be reconsecrated. I can bet you, okay? I can almost bet you that there's going to be a lot of testing around that time because this is the reconsecration of God's temple, and you're going to have to be tested in order to make sure that you're included in that. Now, I want to remind you about why it is that God established those trumpets to begin with. What did he teach Moses about that? Do you remember? He told Moses, you are to blow the trumpet this way, this signal to set out, and this signal to call in. So I want you to imagine this, that all the Israelites would have been standing. They would have been called in, standing, ready. God gave me these scriptures a while ago, and I want to just read them to you because I just know that this is why he gave them to me. And he gave them to me about 3 years ago. Psalm 122, 2-3. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. And then he also gave me this scripture in 2 Chronicles 7 when the first temple was being dedicated. Verse 4, then the kings and all the people offered sacrifices before the Lord. And King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 heads of cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. So the king and all the people dedicated the temple of God. The priests took their positions, as did the Levites and the Lord's musical instruments, which King David had made for praising the Lord, and which were used when he gave thanks, saying, his love endures forever. Opposite the Levites, the priests blew their trumpets, and all the Israelites were standing. So now I can see it. Like, I can understand why he gave this, why he spoke this to me. In conjunction, why he spoke this to me with regard to, I knew when he was talking about this, when he was telling me or speaking these scriptures to me, I knew that he was talking about his temple. I knew he was talking about right now. Obviously, these are things that happened, but I knew that in the context with which he was bringing these scriptures up to me, that he was talking about right now. So I've told you in other videos, and he hasn't really led me to this, but he is obviously leading me to it right now, that there are some things that he's had me write down and that I would share them with you at the proper time. And this is one of the things that he had me write down. When those trumpets blow, Israel will be standing, and that our feet are standing in his gates. We're his city, we're his temple, we're his Israel. I'm just blown away. I could have never known that this was referring to the reconsecration of his temple before he comes, just before he comes. I mean, I knew to a certain extent, but now I can see it really clearly. The Festival of Trumpets should never mean the same thing to you ever again. It really shouldn't. It should mean something very significant to you. And I know we've been a little bit like, well, we're always blowing a trumpet on New Moon. We're always blowing the trumpet over the offerings. We're always presenting ourselves as an offering on New Moon. But this is even more significant, guys. This like brings it into new, deeper meaning. That on the Festival of Trumpets, on the 24th of June 2028, God's people are being called in, the multitude's being called in. And on the 25th, the second day of the new moon festival, that the reconsecration has taken place just in time for these the turn of the year festivals, the seventh month festivals. And then the following year, on June 25th, 2029, I don't think that God's trying to go by the Gregorian calendar. It just so happens that these two dates end up together, or end up the same in 2028 and 2029. But that following year, the 45 days will end on June 25th. And so in those days, we don't know the day or hour, but in those days, Jesus will come. And that third Moadim, the third pilgrimage of the Festival of Tabernacles, will never be the same again. It will be brought to fulfillment. You think about the Festival of Tabernacles, I'm just trying to think about, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean? What do I know about the Festival of Tabernacles? And I know that God established it and told us that he established it in order to remember that he had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when he brought them out of Egypt. And so if you think about that, we've been living in these temporary shelters since he brought us out of Egypt. Foreigners in this land, right? We're foreigners. Who else was a foreigner living in tents with his sons? Abraham. Abraham was a foreigner in the land that he went to live with his sons in tents. But he believed that would be his land. He believed that he would have children more numerous than the stars in the sky. If you could count the stars in the sky, then you could count his children. And we believe, as we are brought out of Egypt, though we live in temporary shelters, we believe that we too will inherit the land, that we will inherit Jerusalem, Mount Zion, Israel. And we're not looking back. We're not saying, in Egypt, we sat around pots of meat. Why did you bring us out here to die? I mean, sometimes we feel that way, right? Are you going to do this thing that you promised to do, Lord? In those days, you're probably going to be thinking similar thoughts. Is he going to fulfill? Has he forsaken us? Has he forgotten us? But God says, in those days, lift your head because your redemption draws nigh. By the time Christ comes back, when we observe that Festival of Tabernacles, we will remember that God had us live in temporary shelters when he brought us out of Egypt. We'll remember that he had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when he brought them out of Egypt. But we'll be in our new shelter. It's not that far away. Listen to this description in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. So it says in verse 6, the priests took their positions, as did the Levites with the Lord's musical instruments, which King David had made for praising the Lord, and which were used when he gave thanks, saying, his love endures forever. Opposite the Levites, the priests blew their trumpets, and all the Israelites were standing. Okay, so I read that to you already. Solomon consecrated the middle part of the courtyard in front of the temple of the Lord, and there he offered burnt offerings and the fat of the fellowship offerings, because the bronze altar he had made could not hold the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the fat portions. There were that many offerings. And listen, like on the one hand, in comparison to everyone who's in the world, not a lot of people are going to be saved. On the other hand, God talks about a multitude that no one could count who are going to be saved. And so that's what this reminds me of, is that Jesus is described as the altar. When he talks about, like, you blind fools, when he's saying to the Pharisees, you blind fools, you swear by the gift on the altar, but what makes the gift sacred? The gift or the altar? And it's the same with us. Nothing makes us sacred but that altar. And you see in Revelation 6 that the witnesses are sitting underneath the altar, and they're saying, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you avenge our blood? And they're given white robes and told to wait a little longer until the full number of their brothers and sisters, the servants of God, have been killed just as they had been. Jesus is that altar. And so when I read this and I think about this, just so many offerings being brought, that the altar that Solomon made couldn't even hold all the offerings. I think about just what a beautiful, I mean, can you imagine that? Like, can you imagine that for a minute? Everybody that's going to be cleaned up and go up in this first resurrection, all of those people who've been martyred for God, who are a sweet aroma and a pleasure, right? We've been created for his good pleasure. All those who are going to be brought to God. I mean, that's something really to look forward to. It's going to be something to behold. So I thought this video might be important just to give a little perspective to those holy days, because a lot of time we're observing those holy days, and same thing with the Israelites. They would have been observing these holy days year after year, month after month, at least month after month, Sabbaths and new moons. But we're doing the same thing, and sometimes we don't have the full understanding of what this means. And so to be able to see this in our own lifetime and understand, like, oh, what does that actually mean, that God would call us in with these this festival of trumpets, and that all the Israelites would be standing, and together on that second day on the new moon festival, and the reconsecration of God's temple is taking place. That's incredible, guys. There's nothing, I don't care what's happened in your life, there is nothing that is more important than being part of that, than being part of the temple of God, having been chosen for something that none of us even deserve. But we are going to appreciate it. We are going to, just because we don't deserve it doesn't mean we're not going to suffer for it. Anyway, I hope that you appreciate this, and I hope that you'll take this to God and discern it with Him.